Today I will be setting a Wilbert Ovation. An ovation is a way that Wilbert displays a burial vault where the lid is angled down towards the family. But before I can place the vault over the grave, I need to make sure that the grave is prepared. It's common that graves are dug a day or two beforehand, and sometimes small pieces of dirt or soil can fall into the grave. With that excess dirt, I create mounds on each end, or if the person is Christian, I create a cross in the bottom of the grave. This allows us to easily remove our gables. And as you can tell, I've got the tail end of the hurricane storms rolling in as I begin my setup. Whether we're using a hilljoy or a vault buggy like you see here, the first step of any burial vault setup is to create a stable platform. And today I'm trying to block up even higher than normal to make sure that the lowering device will sit above one of the headstones on each end of the grave. And I don't know about you, but some days things just go wrong for no reason, and little things just irritate me. Like dropping an aluminum into the grave and then rolling my 4x over. Not any real problems, but just enough to irritate you a little bit. My main concern at this part of the process is just to be sure that the platform is stable, and that if I need to shift the vault back and forth on the platform to align it over the grave, that the movement of the weight doesn't make the 4x fall over or move any of my aluminum boards. Since a small chunk of soil collapsed near the headstone, I went ahead and placed an aluminum board that's cut down shorter to make sure that no one could slip an ankle down into the grave. That is one of the downsides of using the cut down boards that I use, but using these cut down boards nearly eliminates the risk of any family members or pallbearers catching the edge of their ankle or their shin on boards that stick out farther than the 4x. One of our main tasks is making sure that we eliminate all trip hazards as much as possible. Now, in most cemeteries, the alignment of the graves is in an east to west fashion, mostly due to biblical scripture, which created a tradition of burying with the feet to the east and the head to the west, but also to help keep the cemetery organized with the headstones on one side and footstones on the other. Also, with headstones facing east-south and north to west, it's harder for grounds crew to mow and harder for vault men and monument men to come into the cemetery and complete some work. That being said, this vault is an ovation. So we're not paying too much attention to the east and west. We need to pay attention to which way the lid is aligned. So on the top of this blue tarp that's protecting the vault are arrows pointing which way the vault will be aligned in the cemetery. Either way, we still need to make a mental note of which way the casket needs to be placed on the device to let the funeral director know which way to lead the pallbearers. Normally, I will attempt to place the vault over the grave from one end of the grave. That being said, when there's headstones on both ends, that's not possible. So we need to drive to the side of the grave, which creates one extra step of raising the boom up over the vault to be able to drive the boom away from the grave. This is where the hydraulic front tire on the Johnny handler from True Rebel equipment comes in handy. On the front of the buggy is a pulley system that raises the boom into the air, but because the front tire is hydraulic, I can lower the front of the buggy all the way down and only crank up the boom about half as far as I would on one of the older models that we use. Once the boom is high enough and cleared away from the vault, we can drive the buggy forward and then collapse the boom back down and move the buggy out of the way while the service takes place. We also need to be sure that the boom lock is on, which I didn't do quite in time. I was just lucky that the frame didn't slide up towards the front of the buggy, hitting the side of the vault. We spend a lot of time customizing these vaults to the family's preferences, and the last thing we would want to do is damage anything in the cemetery, which is why we bring almost every single color of touch-up paint with us to fix up any little scratches and do our best to avoid putting any chips or damaging the carapace on the top of the vault. Our equipment and our products are seen at the last part of the funeral process, so it's our goal to make everything as perfect as possible when the family are at the cemetery. But now that I've got the vault over the grave, the rain is really starting to come down. The weather is something that we always have to pay attention to, because while we're setting up, it might be hot and sunny with no breeze at all, but if we're not paying attention, a summer storm may roll through. And with a vault such as an Ovation vault, we like to keep those out in the sun so that our equipment and the vault can shine, but if a summer storm rolls in, that's an absolute disaster. So we always try our best to keep an eye on the weather. Working in the elements is probably one of the hardest aspects of being a vault man, but it's also something that can make the committal service extremely hard on the family. So making sure that our tents and trucks are equipped with walls and ropes and anything we might need to block the family from the elements is of the highest priority to a vault man. We can't control the weather, but we want to do everything we can to have the family be as comfortable as possible during the committal service process.
Well, it's raining just a little bit too hard to keep recording right now, but one thing I did want to say is that's where this Johnny handler from True Rebel Equipment comes in. On a day like today, if you were using a Hilljoy on this wet plywood, these wet boards, these wet ramps, getting it to climb up on top of the grave can be extremely difficult. Taking it down off the top of the roof, it can slide on the ramps, turn, flip over. So on a day like today, I definitely prefer using a Johnny handler or a vault cart, vault buggy in general. It makes that process a lot safer and helps out our backs a little bit.
Now, I will typically set my vault in its entirety and have it ready to go before beginning the tent setup process. That's because if anything goes wrong at a committal service setup, it's most likely going to be over the grave, with the grave collapsing, or something malfunctioning with the vault setting process. On a day like today, when the rain is back and forth and I never know when it's going to start up again, I just go ahead and set my tent and get the vault protected before beginning this vault swinging process. The tent that I set on my services is a 15-foot by 28-foot 8-pole tent. It's a 15 by 20-foot 6-pole mainframe with an 8-foot extension with a flat top, which can be problematic during rainfall. If it's raining heavy enough, that flat top will fill up with water and sag down in the middle, completely defeating the purpose of having the extra 8 foot of tent. On the really windy days, setting a tent like this can be incredibly difficult, and it's even worse after it's been raining and the ground is wet, making the tent stakes easier to move around. On a day like today, even though it's around 80 degrees, the wind is really blowing out of the west, so I just wanted to block off some of that wind for the family, but not make it so that the tent warms up really bad underneath. And it'll also help if the rain kicks back up again, the wind won't be bringing the rain right underneath the tent, which would, again, defeat the purpose of having a tent to shield the family from the elements. The main top is supported by 6 extension poles that start in the middle and connect to each of the 6 frame poles. The tent is then held down by a combination of straps and hooks, and if we need to straighten out the tent, we can add some ropes. But even on a day like today, if I were to have set my tent perfectly straight, I still would have roped down at least 4 of the corners to make sure that the wind didn't start moving the stakes in this wet, muddy ground. On the walls, we then use T-stakes, which are, as described, they're T-shaped stakes that are pressed down into the bottom of each wall to keep the wind from coming up underneath the walls and giving family a cool breeze on the cold days or blow in the rain up from underneath. Now that the tent is set and the vault is protected, we can go ahead and begin the swinging process. And with a little bit of rain coming in, I used one of the sets of feet to make sure that my carpet didn't blow off of my boards. With having large headstones on each end of the grave, it makes the swinging process a little bit more difficult, especially since on an Ovation setup, the one-man bar connecting the 2 sets of feet goes in front towards the family, so it will be out of the way. On a normal vault setting service, the one-man bar goes behind the vault, that way it's in between the base and the lid. On an Ovation service, the same logic is used, placing the one-man bar underneath the lid that is leaned down towards the family. To suspend the vault over the grave, we use cables that attach to the reels and are reeled up on each end. The one-man bar allows both sets of reels on each set of feet to move at the exact same time, raising the entire vault in a level manner. And the reason we place the one-man bar between the lid and the base is to make sure that the platform on the opposite side has plenty of room to set flowers and also for me to walk across when assisting the pallbearers with the casket when it's time to place the casket on the lowering device. And recently it was brought to my attention that Wilbert and Wilbert only is allowed to use the Ovation rails. They own the patent, and I was uninformed on that matter. Thankfully, a member of the Wilbert corporate team reached out to me to let me know that they still own the patent and that Wilbert has the rights to this equipment. And having this Ovation equipment is really a necessity when having a customized vault with a print on the very top. These rails allow the lid to lean down around 1.5 feet off the ground so that the top of the print can be easily viewed by the family. And some funeral directors bring a handful of sharpies, and the families will write one last message on the top of the carapace for their loved one. There are almost no limit to the personalization options that can be placed on the top of an Ovation burial vault. Over the years, I've worked services where different family portraits, pictures, pets, sports teams, hobbies, passions, and interests. I've even designed an entire burial vault that was a Wilbert stainless steel triune to reflect the Harley-Davidson logo. The winch system I'm using here today is part of the Wilbert patent on the Ovation device. This winch attaches to both lid carriers, and when the vault is lowered down and the lid is separated from the base, the winch allows this vault lid, which weighs in excess of 1,000 pounds, to gently glide all the way down to the ends of the rails without using any physical labor to do so. The key to separating the lid from the base is making sure all 4 wheels on the 2 sets of carriers are perfectly aligned over the rails. If an error were to be made and one of the wheels comes off the rails, there's a high likelihood that it could damage our lid carriers or damage the vault lid. We lower the burial vault base until we can see the rails on the opposite end. At this height, we know that when we lower the casket, the pistols on the lowering device won't catch on the edge of the vault. Oftentimes, if they catch, the casket will not fit into the vault. It's now time to gently push the lid so the wheels roll on the rails until they pass the first bend. Once they pass the first bend on the rails, the vault cover will naturally glide down to the end of the rails. In this step of the process, you can see why placing the vault over the grave correctly is pivotal in making sure this Ovation setup works. If I were to put it on backwards, when the lid reached the bottom, you would see the entire horizontal carapace would have the name and the photo upside down. For this family, they chose a stack of books, a portrait, and a page from a Sudoku book. And like I said, there's almost anything we can do for the cover of one of these Ovation vaults. Our main goal is to serve the family with care and respect, but also to make each individual graveside service personable to a family and to the individual who has passed. The process of setting the lid down is complete, and we can now move on to setting our frigid imperial lowering device. But before we can set that, we need to inspect the vault and make sure that it's ready to go for service. And that being said, anyone who works with concrete knows just how messy of a job it can be. And although we do rigorous cleaning on our forms and post-production cleaning, sometimes the vaults still need wiped out just to get little specks of dust and concrete out of the bottom, and to be sure that none of the release agent, the oil that we use to separate the concrete from the forms, remain anywhere on the liner. So once that was cleaned up, we can add our lowering device. Unless we're told that it's an oversized casket or a smaller casket, we set the lowering device with 4 holes showing to spread it out to accommodate the average width of a casket. This imperial lowering device can be adjusted for almost any size of casket, and unfortunately that means it can be collapsed down to accommodate a casket as small as 48 inches long. Any casket smaller than that would most likely come as a loved and cherished casket and vault combination, where a lowering device like this would not be used for the interment. Once the lowering device is installed and tightened down, we can add the guide bars and safety bars. And finally, when the lowering device is set, we can add our T-carpets, which cover up our equipment and our 4x4s on each end of the vault.
So this is a problem that we run into sometimes with really large headstones, especially on the foot and the head end of the grave. On today's service, the wind's coming straight out of the west, so I wanted to block off that wall to keep the family dry and out of the elements. Unfortunately, that meant that we have to clear this headstone, which means I blocked up another 6 inches or so to try to raise this vault up higher so that the lowering device would be higher up to clear this headstone. Now it's just barely there, so what we're going to do is we're going to place a blanket over this headstone to make sure that the casket doesn't get scratched and that the casket doesn't damage the stone. Not only for the pallbearer's safety, but also to keep the headstone safe and the casket safe. And I almost forgot the safety bars. These are really important because it's what keeps the casket safe while the service takes place. Rather than leaving the casket sitting on top of the rollers and on top of the straps, we lower it down onto these safety bars. That way, if anything happens to the brake, to the lock, if anything malfunctions, the casket doesn't have anywhere to go. It'll stay safely on the safety bars. That way it doesn't lower down into the vault. One end doesn't lower into the vault. The rollers don't malfunction. It's just a safety precaution to make sure the casket is safe and stable while the service goes on. And that in particular is why I like the Imperial lowering device. Rather than having 3 separate rollers that are detachable, it has 2 sets of pistols that swing freely with a guide bar that attaches the two sets. This means the pallbearers just have to walk up to one end, place it on the first roller, and I'll be up here to assist them, making sure it clears the first strap and the first set of rollers. After that, I don't really have to lift up on it at all. The pallbearers can just pass the casket hand over hand, and it'll slide up the guide bars over the second strap. And while the service takes place, I'll lower it onto the safety bars. That way no one has to step over these lid rails. No one has to straddle over on this side and get everybody all cramped up trying to set it down safely. It simply rolls right across. It stops with the casket brake, and then it lowers down onto the safety bars. Safe and sound, almost no room for error.
For each committal service, we set 12 chairs with 12 chair covers. That's our standard number, and funeral homes can request for more when they know they're either going to have a very large family or a large family with people who have trouble getting around. The chair covers that we use are standard Wilbert blue chair covers, and we also have a different set for tri-guard chair covers and another set for a funeral home that we service that requests their own chair covers. On each service, when it's cold outside, we'll set out 2 lap blankets as well, and every service gets 12 tissues placed on the chairs for the family members. At times I may forget to restock on my tissues, so I'll set 4 tissues, 1 on each end of the first 2 rows. Also in the wintertime, when it's really cold outside, we will wall off the entirety of the tent and place propane heaters, and it warms up the tent around 20 to 25 degrees, depending on how bad the wind is. Each burial vault that we produce receives a trademark that goes on the foot end of the vault. Today it's on the head end because the alignment of the carapace is more important than the trademark. We just need to be sure to let the funeral director know which way the casket needs to enter the lowering device. The trademark is more so that the family can see that the vault they chose in a funeral home is what they received at the cemetery. And the screws on the top of the lid that you see here are just screws that allow us to move the vault lid around in the shop. Most vaults have screws, and some vaults have hooks. And to me it just looks better if those screws are screwed down farther into the lid for when the family arrives. The last thing I do before the family arrives is make sure that all my equipment is polished up from the rain that we just had, that all my carpets are swept off, all my tent poles are straight, and just making sure that everything is tidied up before the funeral arrives. We even need to go over the carapace just to make sure there's no fingerprints or no dust around the outside of the print. As you can imagine, a place that pours concrete and manufactures burial vaults can get pretty dirty at the shop, so once we're here, we just want to make sure that everything is spotless before the family arrives. And this is what the family sees when they arrive at the cemetery. My responsibilities, once the family arrives, includes letting the funeral director know which way that the casket needs to go onto the grave. It also includes picking up the flags off the cars in the procession, making sure that if elderly people are in attendance to the funeral, that they get a hand if they so need, and helping the pallbearers place the casket over the grave. My main responsibility comes after the service is concluded, which in some cases means lowering the casket and sealing the vault in front of the family. One thing I always try to make sure to do is not disturb anything that was placed over the casket by family members. And on a breezy day like today, a few roses fell from the top of the casket, so before I seal the vault, I need to make sure that those are placed back on the head end of the casket where the family chose to place it. Now, unless I'm told to leave it on by the funeral director or family members, the casket spray, which is the casket piece, is removed, but the flowers left by family members may stay. Once the grave is filled, the casket spray will be placed over the grave. Now, some people are confused as to why this process is not always done in front of the family. Now, it is your right to have this process be performed in front of you. The most a funeral director or a grounds crew can do is ask you to stand back away from the service to watch this process. I know personally that a lot of families are not aware that they are allowed to be present for this. Some believe that this process is too hard to watch for some family members. Other family members choose to move on to the repast or the luncheon that occurs directly after the committal service has concluded. And some families will stay for this process. They will view the sealing and lowering of the vault, and they will help with the backfilling of the grave. And some families dig and fill the grave by hand still. It is entirely up to the family's discretion. But one reason that I've heard from funeral directors over the years is that they don't trust their vault man to do the job correctly. And in my opinion, that's more of a reason to stay, to make sure that nothing is damaged, and that the lowering process is done with care and respect. To be fully transparent, not every vault company seals and lowers a vault in this manner. Oftentimes, the burial vault base is placed in the bottom of the grave, and the lid is off to the side on a vault buggy. That being said, the time it will take to seal and lower a vault after removing the tent and picking up all the equipment would take a lot longer than it does for me to lower the vault in front of the family in this manner. This takes around 7 minutes to do in front of the family that's in attendance. It's also very common that a family will designate one person to stay behind and watch this process before moving on to the luncheon or the repast. For me personally, I believe this is a very important part in the funeral experience. I think there's a sense of closure and finality that comes with watching the casket be sealed and the vault be lowered. I know when my grandfather passed away and I did the setup, I was a pallbearer, and I lowered my grandfather into the ground myself. It was a moment that almost felt like it brought my family closer together in that time because they were able to watch me do my job and watch their family member, my grandfather, be cared for correctly in this manner. But what it comes down to are the family's wishes and needs in this situation. If you don't wish to watch this process, that's totally understandable on my point of view. If you want to be involved in every step of the process, I totally understand that as well. It's just my hope that you have plenty of support in a situation such as this, losing a loved one or a family member, and that the funeral home and the vault crew take great care of your family through this process as well. It's now time to seal the burial vault. We first attach our winch and attach the hooks to each end of the vault lid. We can then pull the lid up the rails using the winch and raise the base into the lid. Wilbert burial vaults use a tongue and groove method to seal with a butyl adhesive that's inlaid into the lid during the manufacturing process. When the base is raised into the lid, the seal is displaced around the tongue of the base and seals the burial vault. The concrete on the outside of the burial vault is not what provides the seal. The concrete is there to protect the liner. The combination of the interior liner and the seal between the lid and the base is what gives this vault an air and watertight seal. Now, a drill can be used to raise the base into the lid, but personally, I like to use the hand crank to make sure I have complete and total control. I want to make sure that the lid and the base are aligned perfectly so that when the lip of the base enters the groove of the seal, it disperses correctly right in the center of the butyl adhesive. Also, using a power drill would not work when it comes to lowering the vault. The feet used to raise and lower the vault are geared in a manner in which if you were to reverse a drill and place it on the end of one of the feet and press the trigger, the vault would lower to the bottom of the grave incredibly fast, and that is not at all what I want to happen. Before lowering the vault to the bottom of the grave, I will remove the carriers and the rails. This vault is now sealed and ready to be lowered to its final resting place. I can now use the crank to lower the vault until it reaches the cross that was placed in the bottom of the grave. Now, the reason the cross is so important to a vault man is that these cables have a hook on each end, and that hook can catch on the square end of each side of the vault, which can sometimes make it very difficult to crank the cable through the ground underneath the vault to pull it from the other end. Before placing the cross, I always check the obituary to make sure that the individual being laid to rest was of Christian faith. If not, I simply place a mound on each end and it serves the same purpose. The only thing left to do is remove the cables from underneath the vault and begin the tent teardown process. Today's committal service is complete. From start to finish, this process took around 5 hours. God bless. Take care.